If you take a look across the landscape of gothic and horror fiction, you'll see a lot of shared societal fears reflected in some of the most popular monsters within the genre. After all, that's how these monsters are so often born, out of shared societal fears. When they are initially conceived of, horror monsters represent certain fears, weaknesses, paranoias within our societal stitching. And some monsters only stick around for a little while, but others stand the test of time, and with time and changes in society, they shift and they grow. Their meanings expand. They are interpreted differently by different people, and they can take on entire new metaphors. What's interesting about vampires, however, is that right now we are seeing an explosion of queer and feminist vampire fiction, but vampires have, at least in the world of popular fiction, always been queer and feminist. Obviously, not every vampire story is queer or feminist, not by a long shot, but queerness and feminism have been looped into the DNA of the vampire for well over 100 years. So in this video, I want to take a look at some modern and classic examples of the vampire as a metaphor for queerness and feminist liberation, and why exactly it works as well as it does. In 2025 alone, so far, we have had 2 queer feminist vampire stories. V.E. Schwab's newest novel, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, which is an amazing title, and Kat Dunn's adaptation of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmela, which we'll touch on itself in a little bit. This is Hungerstone, and together these books are a very loud queer feminist scream through the mouths of vampires. That's a terrible metaphor, Willow. Do you want to try that again? No, I'm good. Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil is not a perfect book. I had my issues with it and I talked about them in my last video. But the things that it does well, it does extraordinarily well. Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil is a triple narrative. It follows 3 different women in 3 different time periods beginning in 3 different places. All 3 of these women are queer and all 3 of them become vampires. We have Maria, and her timeline begins in 16th century Spain, Charlotte, whose story begins in 19th century London, and Alice, whose story begins in the modern day in Boston. And this novel is just the latest in a long line of queer feminist liberation stories about vampires. But what it does uniquely well, in my opinion, is through its 3 protagonists, we encounter the metaphor of queer feminist liberation as vampire narrative in 3 different ways. Maria, for example, is hungry. Her story is that of a desperate, bottomless thirst. She's a young woman who marries a wealthy and powerful man in the hopes that that will give her a kind of freedom, a kind of liberation. She will never want for anything again. Unfortunately, and in a bitter irony, her search for freedom leads her to a life of limitations and imprisonment. She is reduced to her biology as a sexual plaything and a baby-making machine and a trophy for her husband to just parade around. And she is savvy to that immediately. She is upset, she's disgusted, and eventually she is given an opportunity to free herself from all of that, become a vampire, and pursue a life of hunger. The story of Charlotte, however, is one of love. But it's hard to talk about her story because it doesn't pick up until after the halfway point. And then we get Alice. Alice is a young Scottish woman who moves to the US for college and for a new start. She's a young lesbian with a lot of anger in her soul. And one night, shortly after starting college, she has a one-night stand with someone called Lottie. You get it? When she wakes up, Lottie is gone, and Alice is a vampire. And she is not happy about it. Whenever she succumbs to her thirst, she is upset and disgusted. She sees it as a curse, not as a liberation. All three of the women in this story are queer, are vampires, and they all see vampirism and life as a vampire entirely differently. This is a novel that adds extra layers to the idea of vampirism as a sense of liberation, as a vehicle for liberation. Maria is such a stereotypical vampire woman. You can see so much of the legacy of the vampire in her, and I think it's really smart to have her story begin so many hundreds of years ago, as though she is a kind of vampire progenitor, not just for other vampires within the narrative, but also on a thematic and metaphorical level. She is where the vampire as a concept begins. Then we move into the complexities of vampirism as a metaphor for love and rage, as if those things are being carried through timelines, through concepts, through changes in literature and popular culture, seeing the vampire as something that is doomed from a romantic perspective, which is something that we've been seeing for decades now. Things like Interview with the Vampire and even Twilight, the doomed love of the vampire. And then we get rage, vampirism as an empowerment for those who feel downtrodden, ignored, abused, belittled, marginalized. Vampirism as liberation in the sense that it provides them with the power to fight back. There is hedonism, love, and rage in this book. It demonstrates the multifaceted nature of the vampire while continuing to keep it laser focused on femininity, feminism, and queerness. By contrast, Hungerstone has a more clear narrative focus, and that is to its benefit because it means that that one thematic focus can be explored and allowed to breathe and blossom in a satisfying way, while still being a relatively short novel. Hungerstone is a retelling of Carmilla, but in the story, our protagonist and Carmilla herself have both been aged up. Our protagonist is Lenore, the most gothic name to ever exist. And she's married to a man who considers himself a captain of industry, although he used her family's money to get himself there. He's a pathetic and cruel creature. And when Lenore meets Carmilla and gently moves from being suspicious of her to being cautious friends with her, she presents to Carmilla a kind of clay to be molded, or a block of granite to be chiseled into something beautiful. Carmilla knows that Lenore is not her true self, is not all that she could be, is not living up to her potential. Carmilla is a kind of catalyst for Lenore's growth. Carmilla is a vampire. She is unshackled and unburdened by so many of the restraints of modern human life. Well, I say modern, this is set in the late 1800s. And because Carmilla is a vampire who passes for human, she's able to empower Lenore and show her a world of possibility, a way to take control of her life, to show her that the shackles that bind her, shackles of patriarchy and capitalism, they are of human design, but Carmilla is beyond human. And through that shifting of understandings and perceiving the world, Lenore can feel differently about life itself. And of course you get the queer romance metaphor here as well, because sapphic love as a concept in and of itself is something that frightens patriarchy and patriarchal men, because it is something that entirely removes men from its equation. Just look at something like The Adventures of China Iron by Gabriela Cabezon Camara. This is a joyous, sapphic, historical adventure set in Argentina, in which two young women fall in love and spend so much of their adventure laughing in the face of patriarchy as they journey across the open landscape of Argentina, feeling unburdened by the expectations of men, by their marriages, by their money. There is a scene where they literally laugh in the face of a powerful man who has no hold over them whatsoever. Sapphic love is the ultimate freedom and the ultimate rebellion against patriarchy. And Hungerstone embodies that better than any book I have ever read, except maybe The Adventures of Chena Iron. Then we come to S.T. Gibson's A Dowry of Blood. At this point, Gibson has written a few Sapphic novels, a few vampire novels, and a few Gothic novels. But I personally don't think anything she's written comes close to her debut novel, A Dowry of Blood, when it comes to the beauty of its writing and the impact of its themes. Because what's unique about this one, when it comes to queer feminist liberation in the form of a vampire story, is that this one focuses on polyamory. Dracula famously had multiple wives, and this is the story of one of his wives, his first wife, and the journey that she goes on, meeting, hating, befriending, and falling in love with those other wives. It's a story of polyamory. It's a story of these wives rising up and killing their sire and husband. It's a celebration of sapphic unity, of community amongst women, in a sexual way, but also in a arguably overtly political way, in the literal overthrowing of a patriarchal man who spreads himself like a disease through society, taking wives, collecting women. In this story, Dracula the vampire is both a virus and a collector. But the things that he is collecting are not things. They are people. They are hungry, thirsty, powerful women who learn to love in a polyamorous sense. And while polyamory can exist in a heterosexual narrative, and maybe even a patriarchal narrative, there is, generally speaking, a queer normalcy to the idea of polyamory. Every friend that I have who's polyamorous is queer, but I'm not going to generalize. And I personally think that polyamory and queerness go hand in hand because they are both rebellions against heteronormativity and conservative patriarchy. The traditional expectation of a nuclear family, a male husband and a female wife who live privately together in a home and have a child or two. It's also restrictive and uninteresting, while polyamory is a glorious revelation. Being queer and polyamorous means spitting in the face of traditional and patriarchal expectations. And this book does that so beautifully, with plenty and plenty of blood. But I did say at the very beginning of this video that vampires have always been queer and have always been feminist. So let's take a brief look at Dracula and Carmela, the two earliest works of vampire fiction. Carmela by Sheridan Le Fanu was published 25 years before Dracula and is explicitly a sapphic vampire story. Dracula, on the other hand, is not explicitly queer, but it certainly has a lot of feminist themes. There are two women at the heart of Dracula's story, Mina and Lucy, who are both friends. Both of these women are straight, but Dracula is the kind of book that demands consideration. And when you look at the relationship between Mina and Jonathan Harker, you see a dynamic that twists tradition around. Jonathan is a very queer-coded character. He submits to Dracula. He is in some ways an inversion of the damsel in distress. And Mina does so much to rescue him, to be the powerful, intelligent, capable person in their relationship. That is a feminist perspective, and for its time was pretty revolutionary. And Lucy is not explicitly polyamorous, but she is a sexually liberated woman. A woman who flirts, a woman with multiple suitors, and a woman who gives in to her temptation, gives in to her lust. She's a woman who is, through being infected by vampire blood, tainted by something else, something other, something frightening, at least from the perspective of white British conservative norms of the time period. Lucy has been tainted, poisoned, and thus unshackled. There is so much feminine power and liberation in Dracula. Likewise, and even more extremely, Carmela is a story of giving in to temptation, a story of queer feminist liberation. And what's even more daring about this book, in my opinion, is that it's genuinely terrifying. This is arguably a horror novel first and foremost. It's wonderfully camp and schlocky, even for its time period, as so many Gothic novels were. But when it frightens, it really frightens. There are moments in this story that will set your teeth on edge. Moments that will make your spine shiver. And by doing that, Sheridan Le Fanu was creating an expectation in the reader that this is something taboo. Frightening things often are. Frightening stories are often taboo because they feature so much bloodshed, so much desecration of normal life. Horror stories are often full of other taboos, even something as simple as gratuitous sex, which, depending on the time period, is scandalous as hell. And so by creating a taboo atmosphere through Gothic horror, we are then setting up the expectation for other societal norms to be broken. And that happens in this book as you have a young vampire love story between two teenage girls. A lonely and isolated girl who lives almost entirely alone with her father in a big empty castle is seduced by a wild and cryptic stranger, a young vampire girl. We are now in this story living outside of a world of normalcy and heteronormativity. This is a topsy-turvy world of sapphic vampire horror, breaking so many molds, injecting so many taboos, creating something so exciting and bold. And for 1872, that was extraordinary. The vampire as an immortal and hungry thing that preys on humans, that skulks at night, that looks human but lives an inverted life. That is also something that has become so synonymous with lust and sexual freedom, along with power and fear. It's pretty easy to see how this thing works so well as a vehicle for feminist and queer liberation. Because throughout Western history, queerness and feminism are things that have been feared and therefore marginalized by our conservative and heteronormative societal boundaries. The aesthetics, the behaviors, the stories of vampires go so hand in hand with the hedonistic freedoms of queerness and femininity. I love this, and I'm so curious to see how it continues to progress. And don't get me wrong, this is not always the case. Grady Hendrix, for example, did entirely the opposite with this novel, presenting the vampire instead as a middle-aged, middle-class white man who feeds on ethnic minorities, who sucks the life out of people. It's not unusual to compare the billionaire class or landlords to things like vampires and leeches, things that drain the rest of us of our life. And Hendrix did just that in this book. Vampires do not have to be sexy. They do not have to be queer. They do not have to be feminist. And Hendrix proved it with this amazing novel. But pretty frequently, vampires are symbols for queer liberation and feminism. And in my opinion, it's when vampires are at their most interesting. But the more that it gets done, and we've seen it twice this year already, are we watering that down? Is it all becoming a little bit diluted? Well, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil wasn't perfect, but it did push the idea in a few new directions. And I'm assuming that is the trajectory we will continue to take. And I'm very excited for that. I'm excited for the future of vampire fiction, especially as it pertains to queerness and feminism. I guess we'll see what happens. Now, in my book, Managing and Other Lies, there is a gothic story, the titular Managing. And there is a vampire of sorts. And my kind of interpretation of the vampire is certainly not anything like what we've described here. Arguably, it is more like what Hendrix did. This is still a queer book, but it's not always about queer liberation. It is often about queer sorrow and queer anger. And if you're interested in what all of that means, you can go down under the like button, clicking it along the way, obviously, and you can buy a copy of this. And you can find out how I approach the vampire through a queer lens that is not about liberation. It is still horribly f***ed up though. These stories are nasty and I'm very proud of them. And if you really enjoyed this video, you can show me your love and support on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you can change my life. I would love your support and there are plenty of benefits. So patreon.com/WillowTalksBooks is where you can do that. Thank you, and subscribe for books.